Welcome to the Bright Room podcast. We interview founders, thought leaders, and everyday pirates to discover new approaches to old problems for a brighter tomorrow.
Around a year and a half ago, I decided to make a really dramatic change and leave my design management job in a pretty prolific tech company. And that was a period of wrangling with these deeper layers of fears that surfaced as I was contemplating the decision. And when the day finally came that I surrendered my laptop, my job title, my keys and everything, and realizing this combination of a profound loss of identity and a loss of any external validation, and a loss of all of these things that I unconsciously have identified myself with for a long time.
Yeah.
Letting that go and gradually start to embrace the freedom that came with the uncertainty and the unknown.
Hi, my name is Irina. I'm a coach, a psychologist, and the founder of Bright Room. Bright Room is a social network for learning and development. You can imagine it as Udemy, except the classes are happening live and you learn in small groups with other people. We believe that in order to solve the really big problems our society is facing today, we need to get really good at working together. And that's a continuous journey of personal development, learning, applying, reflecting, and doing it all over again. So Bright Room is there to make this journey as easy and as engaging as it gets. This podcast was born in a desire to complement our mission of helping people work better together by sharing inspirational stories from people and companies who have an unconventional way of doing and being.
Today we're going to be talking to Lynn Cassie, and we're going to be exploring the topic of change and uncertainty. They say the only constant thing is change, and it feels like it's just been picking up pace in the past years. I don't know, maybe people at all times have always said that and have always felt that, and only retrospectively can we really compare, but it certainly has been like that for me, and I'm one of the people who actually loves change, so I can only imagine how that must be just for all of us. And we're going to be exploring it from the perspective of the individual, but also from the societal perspective, and what can we all do about it perspective. So Lynn Casey, maybe you can just start introducing yourself with a bit of background and how you became fascinated with this topic.
Well, thank you, Irina. So my name is Lynn Cassie, and my whole life seems to have been steeped in changes and uncertainties. So I was born in China, and my family moved to Canada almost like it felt like an unexpected change when I was around 12 years old. And then I decided to move myself to Germany over a decade ago. So that has been kind of like the 3 life segments that I had so far. And each of them was in a completely different context with completely different expectations and completely different social construct. So the experience of navigating those 3 different places and 3 segments of life at 3 very different points of my life has been this process of understanding constant change, both externally and internally, and also gradually learning to embrace and grow with it. Because at one point it really felt like something I wanted to stop altogether. So yeah,
Tell me more about this journey towards embracing, because I can imagine that wasn't the first step, especially when like you're young and you don't have, I guess, much, maybe it doesn't feel like you had much agency in the choice. You're just taken and you just moved. You had to start everything from scratch. What was it like for you, this first encounter with big change?
Yeah, I think at first there were a lot of emotions of love and the mourning and fear, because it was kind of a pretty important time of a person's life, around these preteen years, just as a person is starting to grow into more of a young adult. Like this transition period, in my life especially, was pretty formative in a sense. And feeling like I had no choice in the matter, that from one day to another, my mom told me, we're applying a passport for you and we're moving to Canada. I had no idea what that meant, but I knew something was changing, and I was going to leave my friends. I was going to leave my comfort zone. I was going to leave everything I knew behind. And we told no one for various reasons, and packed our lives in 2 suitcases per person and never looked back. So, and also settling into Canada, it was quite a shock, because that was my first experience with a completely foreign culture. I did not know really a word of English except for hello and goodbye, and having to learn a completely new language and learn a completely foreign set of customs and the city design and everything. It was so unfamiliar. I think everything about this new life was unfamiliar, but mixed into it was of course this like feeling of sadness and loss, but at the same time, the excitement. So this is when the excitement started to happen, is recognizing, oh, this is different. This is, wow, this is completely new. Like, what is that about?
When was the first time you felt the excitement?
Probably in the grocery store. It was such, even though in hindsight, it was one of the discount grocery stores in Canada, called No Frills, but it was so different than everything that I knew in China, like from the farmers markets and from some of the supermarkets that I gradually started to know, like, shortly before we moved. It was just so different. I was collecting all these little coupons, and I had no idea what they meant. And they're probably just some like, coupons for saving 10 cents off yogurt. And I thought they were so exciting, and I was mailing them to my friends. Yeah. Yeah, the grocery store was probably the first place.
That's beautiful. So it's the small things that can pave the way to seeing things from a different light. But what else did you learn in this phase of your life? How did it shape you as who you are today?
So the first one was actually challenging some limiting beliefs before I even knew what limiting beliefs were. So I remember one day I was walking home from school. I was, 12, and English was kind of challenging at the time. I didn't want to be the dumb kid in the class who didn't know how to say anything. And I remember part of myself saying, this is such a difficult language to learn. Why am I here? But another part of myself started to see things differently and say, okay, is there any way to see this situation differently? You know what? It's just 26 letters in different combinations. I'm sure I can figure out a way of making this work. So I think that was the first moment that I recognized this, myself challenging my own limiting beliefs. And then after that, we moved around quite a bit in Toronto. This is where my parents and I settled. And with moving around came changing schools. And every change was, at first, it was a little bit daunting. But after a while, it felt like new opportunities to reinvent myself, like every time. For example, even adopting the name Cassie, it was something I did when I changed schools for the first time in Canada. It's a long story, but it's like a 12-year-old child's opportunity to adopt a new identity. And that was exciting, was interesting, and I like the name. So yeah, so that sort of comes with this excitement surrounding the constant evolution of my own identity as my environment was shifting.
Okay, so you consciously created a new identity.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah.
How is that? How is Casey different than Lynn? If you could just kind of imagine them as two different people.
Thank you for that. No one's asked me that before. So
I don't know if that's too personal, so feel free
okay.
to ignore
Yeah.
it.
It's actually an interesting exploration because Lynn has something to do with my root. Because I'm used to people calling me, like in China, people will call me by my Chinese name, which is the last name plus first name in that order. And I'm used to being called that. But I'm not used to hearing the name Lin being called in it by itself in the context that's not Chinese. So I think this is like my own conditioning. In my own conditioning, this is what I associate with the word name Lin is actually something to do with my roots and something to do with an older part of myself. Whereas Cassie is an identity that has been built since moving to Canada. So the professional identity, a Canadian identity, and later an international identity was all built on Cassie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So did the embracing change came already in that supermarket, or how did you, when did you come to like really maybe starting to look forward to change? And you said that, then you consciously moved yourself to Germany, so that was a big change that you initiated yourself. When did this shift happen?
I think that's a gradual change and it's still ongoing because for the very, in the earlier years, that change was like a reaction to an external circumstance. For example, whenever my parents decided to move, I had no choice but to move. And this was a reaction to the changes. How can I make the best out of this situation? But it didn't necessarily mean I wanted that change to happen. So there's a really different relationship with the change that takes place. One of the very, I guess, like important milestones was when I was working on my second job. So this was 2008, 2009. I was freshly graduate from design school, and I was so excited to be working as a designer and at these like pretty big companies. At first a housework company and then an architecture firm. I really loved the job because it was, 2008. For those old enough to remember, it was, a turbulent time financially. And I was seeing rounds after rounds of layoffs in both of these companies that I worked for. And then in 2009, I was laid off myself. So this was, again, one of those unexpected changes that happened. And at first, it was like there was a lot of, again, mourning, a lot of pain, a lot of struggle. But with that came this kind of call to make the best out of the situation that I found myself in. So I actually, after that, freelanced for 5 years. And in this freelancing period, I started to learn what it meant to rely on my own skill set and the unpredictability that is actually in everything around us. And also started to challenge my preconditioned notion of things being solid, stable, and unchanging. Because a lot of these I later learned to be kind of like illusory. They're not really true. So this was like the first exposure to recognizing nothing is as solid as I previously thought it was. So how do I work with that? But this period was still kind of like a struggle over time because I think deep down inside, I still wanted things to be stable. And that layoff happened again 10 years later. But that's a different story.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I just want to pause here for a little bit because I was also thinking that it's maybe one of the biggest illusions, this sense of safety that people get when they're employed, and it's always kind of said that self-employment comes with uncertainty and this lack of safety, and all of that is true, obviously. If you think about it, maybe there is more certainty in being self-employed because at least you have the full visibility, and in the end, it's up to you to deal with whatever is there. Whereas when you're employed, you can't control a lot of things, and it can just flip one day to the other, and you wouldn't get any warning or anything. So from that perspective, there's much more uncertainty in an employed position rather than in an unemployed position or like self-employed. So I always thought it's very interesting how the perception is so different. It's like the polar opposite perception of safety that we normally get from employment. Maybe not these days, but in general.
Yeah. It could be, could also just be related to what you were alluding to earlier, that change is happening so much faster these days. It seems to be on larger scales and speedier. Maybe for a long period of time, there was more of a sense of certainty and more sense of security in employment. Because if I were to think back to my parents' generation, there definitely was more security and certainty in a fixed position. But things have changed dramatically in the past, I don't know, even 10 years, significantly. And maybe people's perception of that hasn't really changed as quickly. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess what I'm sensing on a societal level, if we kind of take these stages of dealing with uncertainty and change, we're still at the fear and anxiety level, and we haven't really fully embraced it on a global scale, and maybe haven't really learned collectively how to make the best out of it and look at it from the perspective of opportunity rather than reacting towards what's happening.
It's a process, and it will take time.
Yeah, for sure. So now you're actually, I mean, it's a big part of what you do as a coach and as a facilitator, helping people navigate change. You want to tell a little bit more about the work that you do in that space?
Sure. Going back to how I arrived at this place. So having been through witnessed many rounds of layoffs and dissolutions of my own teams, I actually came face to face with something that I haven't faced before, which is an intentional decision to leave a very well-paying job and jumping back into the unknown. Because before, even though when I was facing the layoff situations, those again were, I guess, like changes that was outside of my control. I didn't really choose to be laid off. I didn't choose for my team to be dissolved. But how do I react and respond to the situations? It taught me a lot. Although I gotta say that back then, I don't think I was emotionally ready to choose sitting with nothing by myself. So around a year and a half ago, I decided to make a really dramatic change and leave my design management job in a pretty prolific tech company. And that was a period of wrangling with these deeper layers of fears that surfaced as I was contemplating the decision. And when the day finally came that I surrendered my laptop, my job title, my keys and everything, and realizing this profound loss of identity and a loss of any external validation, the loss of all of these things that I unconsciously have identified myself with for a long time.
Yeah.
Letting that go and gradually start to embrace the freedom that came with the uncertainty and the unknown. So I intentionally did not look for jobs. I did not interview. I did not even start my own new projects except for writing a book for a year. So in this kind of like liminal space of just sitting with the deeper layers of experiences that was arising in relation to the unknown, to the changes, and to the fears, to all these sense of mourning, all of the stuff that was arising. So this had to happen. And when that period was finished, it came time to do something about it, in a sense. And that's when I started to focus more on the topics of changes and uncertainties. And I started to conduct workshops and also coaching and mentoring sessions on the topics. And at the same time, because I was actually going through a mindfulness meditation teacher training, I was incorporating a lot of these mindfulness practices into the workshops and sessions I was running. Because there's actually a lot of really interesting philosophies and also practical tools in mindfulness that translates very beautifully into everyday lives, whether that's, private life or work life. So the work I do is both with individuals, and also I'm going to the space of working with organizational leadership teams right now, because I see how important it is for leaders to find their own centered groundedness when it comes to change and lead from that place of intentionality so that their team can also revolve around it and move forward from that place.
So it came about as a result of this 1 year exploration and the time that you had given yourself to just sit and observe whatever comes up for you during that period of time. You said that you were emotionally not ready to take this step back then, but I don't buy it. You did do it yourself, so you must have been ready. I mean, I can imagine it wasn't comfortable, but you must have been ready enough.
Ready. So the process took 6 months. I started contemplating the idea in March 2022 and explored the fears that came up as I was just contemplating quitting. And then gradually becoming deep, understanding the emotions themselves deeper. Where did it come from? And a lot of these fears were actually not necessarily my fears, but it starts to recognize my mom in them. And then some I recognize my dad in them. And then some of it is something else. So gradually all of those things, I guess, became more transparent. And then at some point, I just had enough of it. I said I have enough. This is going on for too long. I decided this is what I'm going to do. But honestly, there was also a practical component. I was saving money for that entire time. So that needed to happen as well before I was ready to submit my letter.
Yeah, makes sense. What are you noticing in your work with groups and individuals on this topic?
So my work with, okay, let's start maybe with groups. I ran this workshop a number of times at conferences, and a lot of times there's actually a lot of like people's personal relationships with changes and uncertainties, especially if they're in a leadership position, that maybe they haven't had enough opportunities to look at, and they were expected to make rational outwards decisions. But the relationship that they have with the changes and uncertainties, and maybe even this fear component and discomfort component, I'm not sure if there was enough space in their work or in their individual lives for them to explore that space. So this is something that I'm noticing, especially with people in leadership positions, whether junior leaders or people who have a lot of experiences. So that's quite prominent. And I think this is the other one that comes up is self-criticism and this like beating oneself up because I'm not doing good enough of a job. Am I letting people down? Am I letting myself down? So there's actually a lot of intensity around compassion toward the self. That also surfaces.
Okay, so it's beating yourself up about just not handling certain things, or is it also about kind of maybe not accepting that you're not able to embrace change as well? Like, I wonder if that's something that comes up as well in terms of like, kind of like when you're feeling anxiety about feeling anxiety. I wonder if that's something also that happens. It's like you feel, I don't know, this discomfort with change and like all the feelings that are associated with that, but then you're blaming yourself for having those feelings, as in like maybe you expect yourself to kind of just jump over it and be ready to embrace it and everything, but then you notice that those feelings are there and you're not quite able to accept them.
Seen examples of both.
Yeah. So how do you move, like, let's say on an individual level, if we can start there, how do you move from this reactivity with change to actually riding the wave of change?
So yeah, one of my favorite quotes is from Viktor Frankl. Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And within the space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our freedom and our growth. So it's one of my favorite quotes. So creating the space itself is a practice. And that's actually what mindfulness practices really are about, is actually this gradual creating of space and a gradual embracing and stepping into an observer's perspective about everything that is happening in life. It's whether a disturbance in that the barista didn't give me my order or correctly, or it's about like something, a job being laid off, or something even bigger like war and such. So there's that stimulus that's coming from the external world, but are we reacting to that? Is it the trained pattern of reaction? And where is that reaction coming from? With a lot of the mindfulness practices, what happens is we train ourselves to become aware of our reaction to external stimuli, and then gradually to recognize that's happening and to create a space between what we recognize and how we actually choose to respond to it. And to do that, it's actually not just a cognitive exercise. There's a cognitive component to it. But interestingly, one of the most important pieces of recognizing and creating space is the acceptance of whatever is arising for myself in the moment. And that arising could be these emotions, it could be the thoughts, and very importantly, bodily sensations. Because oftentimes we actually don't know what the reaction is, but we sense something. And training ourselves to be more sensitive to what is happening within ourselves, body and mind, and emotionally, gradually helps us to create a space between the two, the stimulus and the response.
That's so interesting, because I guess in a way it's also a bit counterintuitive, because if there is discomfort, we more likely tend to avoid it in whatever way possible. It seems safer. It seems like, yeah, nobody wants to sit in a dark room if you're afraid of the darkness. You want to quickly go for the door and get somewhere else. But it seems like in this process, it's more important to actually sit in the dark room.
So if we always run from the dark room, then the fear itself is enforced every time. It's actually not changed.
Do you have any practical examples that you can share, whether from your life or some
about
dealing with this change? How do you actually do it? Because in theory that sounds, even in theory it doesn't sound easy, yeah? But let's say it sounds sort of straightforward, but I guess the question, even just conceptually when you think about it, is what is next? okay, so I sit down and now I'm aware of all of this stuff that's happening. And maybe I'm overwhelmed and all I want to do is cry. And okay, I do that. And what next?
So I have personal experiences with this. And also, I did some research where I interviewed 18 people earlier this year about their experiences dealing with sudden change and uncertain situations. So this acceptance part, it seems to be one of the most foundational in helping somebody make changes in an intentional way down the road. And how people come to these acceptance and being with whatever is happening is very individual and different. One example in my own personal life was in 2018. I had a very nice team in Zalando. And we seemed to be on an upward trajectory. Everything was going really nicely until one day we were all called into a room, our entire department, and we were told that there's some changes to the strategy, to the direction, and we needed to be reshuffled. And the new plan, I didn't see a role for my team. So in that one day, from one moment to another, I lost 9 out of 12 designers on my team. And I was redistributed into a different department, basically to form a new team. So all of this brought up a lot of anger and a lot of resentment and a lot of just like really nasty feelings, to be honest. And I was trying everything I could to make the situation better. So I was interviewing for other jobs, and I was trying to build a new team in a different department by myself. I was talking to a senior VP of a different department. And after 3-4 pitching sessions, he basically told me if I wanted the team, it's mine. So I was so happy that this was going to happen. And then I hear nothing. And I hear nothing. And then one day, my PM and I were called into a meeting with him. And then he apologized to us and said he needed to make a 3 million euro budget cut. And we weren't the only people who were affected. So from one moment to another, like I had all my hopes on creating this team and building something that maybe is better than my current situation. I did everything I could to try to make that happen. And that dissolved from one second to another. So by this point, I was feeling really downtrodden. I was not getting any opportunities externally, and then everything I tried internally was not panning out. And I was stuck in this job that I didn't like, doing things I didn't want to do. And I was just really, really angry. And I felt like I didn't want to go to work anymore. And I wanted to call in sick and just take sick leave for as long as I could. And it got to such an intense state that I just felt like I couldn't even sit in my own apartment anymore. So something, almost like something pushed me to get out. So I walked outside, and I continued to walk aimlessly, listening to music and letting myself. This time, I think what I did differently was that I actually just allowed myself to feel whatever was happening inside of me, and I didn't care what emotion that was coming up. I just walked and felt it, walked and felt it, and walked and felt it. And when things got tough, I was telling to myself, this too shall pass, this too shall pass. And I was repeating it over and over and over and over. And the walk lasted for about 2 hours to 3 hours, and just walked on and on and on. And by the end of that walk, I remember sitting beside the Spree, and I was looking around, and something felt different. I didn't feel sad anymore. I didn't feel like I needed sick leave anymore. I was like, wait, something's changed. And then a new thought came to me. I was like, wait, this is my life. I'm not going to sit here and blame and have a bad time. You know what? I'm going to go to work tomorrow, and I'm going to have a good time. I'm going to have a lot of fun. And then the next morning when I went into work, that's what I decided to do. And all of a sudden, all these new opportunities start to show up in the confines of my then job situation. I started to see, oh wait, there's an opportunity to introduce automation to the way that we're working as a team to cut error rate and to reduce the amount of hour we spend on manual labor so that designers can actually work on something more interesting. And I started to see that opportunity everywhere. And then I started to do that. And it became a really exciting task, actually. And then external opportunities started to show up as well. And because my attitude toward all these opportunities have shifted, I'm sure how I showed up in interviews was different as well. Okay?
I love it. It's very powerful and inspiring how you just made the decision to take control and have fun.
Although I must say the decision wouldn't have come if the allowing of the emotions didn't happen. Like this is only something that became really clear years later after I started to more formally practice some of these mindfulness practices. Is I realized in hindsight this was what was happening. Is the acceptance was being allowed so that the emotions can metabolize themselves so that they can take their course and just leave. They didn't have to stay and make imprints and create new fears.
Yeah. The image that I got when you were saying, like telling me the story, is a bit like, little kids when they're upset about something and they're in this state of, I don't know, crying or throwing tantrums or whatever. Well, I don't know if anybody has ever succeeded. I certainly haven't, like having a lot of younger siblings. You cannot negotiate with a kid in that state. The first thing that you need to do is just acknowledge their feelings and help them see that you see them and that it's okay, and maybe show some compassion for whatever is happening with them. And once they see that, then they're able to actually communicate with you, and then they can tell you more why they're feeling that way, and then you can kind of together start moving to the next step. And what you were describing, it felt a lot like this situation with a kid, except the kid is us, ourselves, and maybe the feelings that we have. And it's very hard to move somewhere until you really give them space to be and show some acknowledgement and appreciation, maybe even for whatever is happening.
Yeah, actually, I do that, what you describe as what the kids do in my private relationship. It's very useful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all of us are just kids. In the end of the day, it's I mean, the bodies grow, but otherwise, a lot of things stay the same. Question. So this whole experience, it seems that you have this capacity to figure things out for yourself, just historically speaking, also from the story that you shared, where you just kind of go through some processes and then you decide, okay, I'm going to look at the situation from a different perspective. And you're able to shift this mindset. Is there, well, first of all, I guess not everybody is able to do it in general, and then it takes time, even if somebody does, and I mean, it took time for you as well. What is the responsibility and opportunity for organizations to support people with this change, support individuals and support teams? How do you see that?
So I didn't go at this alone. Like I had many really amazing therapists and coaches over the years. So a lot of this stuff that gradually became a practice with other people over and over and over, like over a long period of time. And I feel privileged to have been able to do that because in my positions, in my previous roles, we were able to get support, like working with coaches. So like this gets a little bit intricate and also very nuanced because I think everyone has a responsibility But for example, as an individual, I have a responsibility toward myself and taking responsibilities for my actions and my choices. This is like the responsibilities that's inherently mine. And interestingly, it's this responsibility that actually gives a sense of freedom, not a lack of responsibility to my actions and my choices. So as an individual, I can see just focusing on these two things as potentially being immensely freeing. That being said, it is also a process that will take time and effort and lots of perhaps reflection and feedback. So organizations, it gets challenging because it gets very complex pretty quickly. But as organizational leaders, I think it's the same thing. Our leaders reflecting on their responsibility because when one is in a leadership position, what one does and how one thinks, acts, says, and does have direct impact on other people. So this is actually a much more serious type of responsibility. So this self-reflection, I think, becomes very important for organizational leaders and for leaders to be extremely honest with themselves about their own actions and responsibilities and recognize how this may be impacting other people in the org. So this is something that I think often could be missing in a lot of the conversations I see in organizations, is that organizations, especially the tech companies I worked for, tend to focus very heavily on very quick and direct outcome and focus on the numbers and focus on all this other stuff that seems to be a little easier to grasp and more tangible. And the self-reflection often it could be missing. And this honest self-reflection, not just any self-reflection. Yeah. So self-reflection for leadership and recognizing sorry?
Yeah, sorry. No, I was going to say it's hard to put reflection in the KPIs. That's that's where the challenge is coming from.
Maybe there's room for us to reflect on the way that companies are actually created. If we really want, even better outcome, some of these less tangible factors are actually perhaps more important than we give them credit for. Because I always find it really funny. It's like, oh yeah, let's focus on outward actions and outward results. Okay, so what is contributing to our actions, our thoughts? Okay, anyone talking about that? Not really.
Yeah.
The outcome is a direct reflection of our thinking processes and our emotional processes. But we don't really talk about those things in the open.
Yeah, that's true. It's like trying to impact how the flowers look like by addressing the flower itself, whereas you kind of need to address the root and the soil, everything that comes into that, and everything else is just the result of previous effort there.
Exactly.
Can you tell me a little bit more about this connection of responsibility and freedom? Because I know a lot of people see responsibility as something that detracts from their freedom. And I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned that responsibility is freedom.
It really depends on what we understand as responsibility, I think. What I'm talking about here is very radical self-responsibility. It's a recognition that the only thing that's actually really within my control are my actions, my choices. Like even that sometimes is influenced by other factors, of course, but I can still, through practice and through reflection, understand what am I choosing and how am I acting, and be very mindful, intentional about what it is that I'm doing, like what kind of actions am I taking and what choices am I making. So I learned this pretty vividly, like when I was doing a year-long experiment. So I did a year-long experiment in journaling and reflection, and I observed the changes over time. Everything was documented. It was very fun. And then at the end of the year, I realized for the longest time in my life, I was looking at my world through a very tinted lens. That meant I wasn't really examining my own actions, especially in relationships with friends and in intimate relationships, to understand the outcome. So one really interesting example is this friend of mine. Like, we were really close friends for quite a while. And for some reason, all of a sudden, that friendship dissolved. And this dissolution haunted me for like a long time. Until years later, in 2020, I decided to reach out to her and ask her, hey, I'm doing some reflection right now. This thing has been with me for a long time. If there's something I did in the past, can you please tell me? But she basically said, okay, such a long time ago, like if you want to chat, I'm here now. So to me, it sounded like a little dissatisfying because I wanted an answer from her. I wanted her to tell me what did I do wrong that contributed to this dissolution of our friendship. But I didn't get a satisfying answer. So, life continued, and I continued doing my reflections and journaling and all this stuff until I think 6 months after. I was at dinner with another friend who was describing her relationship with another friend their relationship was dissolving. And she was telling me how this other friend was so self-centered that she only wanted to do and talk about the things that interest her and didn't really care about anything that interested this other person. So that's why their relationship is dissolving. And then I had a moment of epiphany. I was like, oh, I was like that lady. Like I was the one who was so fixated on my own issues and fixated on what I was interested in that I actually wasn't there for my friend. And I never saw it that way before. In my narrative, I was doing everything right, and something happened that, I wasn't aware of, and this friendship ended. But that was like a moment of, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then I wrote another note to my friend, and I said, my friend from 10 years ago, and I was like, I realized this. I'm sorry that I actually realized that I wasn't a good friend back then because I didn't have the space to allow me to really be there for you. And then after that, she replied and she said, wow, this is an amazing reflection, like, and then she's like, also, but please don't underestimate all the great stuff that, was also part of you then. The interesting thing is that when that response came in, I didn't feel attacked. I felt liberated. It was like, oh, wow, I can see myself and my actions through a different lens now. I'm not always in the right. There are these things that I was doing in my life that from a different perspective, it looks like this. And if I can own that, then I felt immensely free. And I did the same thing with my ex-boyfriend, whom I accused of this and that for a long time. And I wrote him an apology too. And I said, I never acknowledged my own part in this relationship. So I'm sorry that these are my actions. And then that changed the way that we related to each other. It was no longer a fight anymore and actually enabled us to be friends.
Okay, so
Yeah.
now I see exactly what you mean by both radical responsibility and how it connects to freedom. I think it's a nice place to slowly close off. I want to give you a chance to share any kind of final things if you have anything.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the stuff that we talked about today it sounds like really practical tools that maybe and also practices that we can do to work with changes and uncertainties. But it's very easy to stay in a place where, the underlying desire is still for the change and uncertainty to go away, right? So I employ this tool to make it better so that I can feel more certain and more safe. So the underlying relationship has not changed, which is fine. It's like, it's okay to learn how to work with changes and uncertainties. But at some point, what I found to be immensely powerful is shifting the relationship with changes and uncertainties fundamentally. So instead of this kind of, I want you to go away because I'm still afraid of you attitude, to, okay, there's infinite opportunities and infinite learning and playfulness inside uncertainty and the unknown. Some of the really beautiful quotes that I remember people saying when I was doing all these interviews back in February was that, when we recognize that everything's changing all the time, then every moment is a potential moment for a surprise. And that's really nice, I find. And when the relationship with change and uncertainty fundamentally changes, and I feel that's also empowering. And also, on top of the self-responsibility, adds another layer of freedom, because it's no longer like I'm fighting against something that's much bigger than me and I want to make the world go my way. Instead, it's about flowing with what is happening and seeing the opportunities that maybe I wouldn't otherwise see. So at some point on the journey, it stops becoming a reaction, and it really starts to be a flow with the circumstances around us all the time.
We need to resist the resistance is what I'm taking away. Okay, so there is one little thing that I'm playing with for this podcast. It's a chain of questions from one guest to another. So the last guest that I've spoken with, this episode hasn't been released yet, I asked our guest to ask a question to our next guest without knowing who it would be. So this is a question to you from Lily, who's a people and culture lead in a tech company. And she's asking you, what makes you happy these days?
What makes me happy these days? How do we define happiness? Anyways, so
another 1 hour podcast.
yes. Okay, I'm going to define happiness as maybe a foundational sense of well-being and satisfaction. So coming to that place of foundational satisfaction, which I find is actually a state that's constantly fluctuating anyway. There's this place of happiness I can come back to, but it is actually not, on a graph. It wouldn't be the top of the graph. It wouldn't be the bottom of the graph. It's actually in the middle. So it's about coming back to my clarity and coming back to my equanimity, because any of these spikes is actually not that happiness.
Okay, so happiness is in equanimity.
To me, personally.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And what would be your question for the next guest?
Putting me on the spot.
Yeah.
What makes life worth living?
Ooh. Looking forward to this one. Amazing. All right, Lin Cassie, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
And I think it made me also, I think I'm going to introduce some changes in my life just based on this conversation. So thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to share all of the details, how to connect with you in the description, so people can find you and learn more about your work.
And thank you very much. It's very enjoyable.